All right. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good morning. Well, yeah, good morning. So thank you all for coming
For this, please. Yeah, take. I'll just grab one. But yeah.
Welcome. So someone in the community requested to have a little presentation about Passover. And we'll talk mostly about Passover itself, a little bit about its connections to Easter also. But as Pastor Jim mentioned, right, it's not an accident that these two holidays occur at the same time of year, although that doesn't mean that they are the same, of course. But unlike, say Hanukkah and Christmas in December, where there really is an accident that they occur at the same time of year, there's no conceptual connection whatsoever between those two holidays. Here there really is, and in fact the date of Easter is you probably can explain this better than I, but my understanding, Pastor Jim, is that the date of Easter is tied, at least Western Easter, is tied to Passover on the Jewish calendar.
It's on a lunar calendar.
The same lunar calendar based on the Hebrew calendar as well. So already right there, it's not an accident, and there's conceptually some commonalities there. This is, I think, it's a good example of how both Christianity and Judaism have inherited the scripture and religious language of ancient Israel, but have done very different things with it, and understood them in very different ways, but still drawing on that shared scripture and that shared heritage from ancient Israel. So I thought I would start with try to clear up what I think are a few myths or misconceptions about Passover, and then we'll go through some of the basics of how it's actually celebrated today. All right, so some of these are myths or misconceptions, and some of these might be like fairly provocative, so just brace yourself. I was doing this last night, and I decided, you know what? Let's just go for it. I feel like I know most of you, and you know me, and we have a certain trust here. So I'm going to say some things that may be a little provocative, and we're just going to go with it. All right. All right. So our first myth. This really is a myth, right? Matzah, the unleavened bread that Jews eat on Passover, contains the blood of Christian children. Now that sounds ridiculous, of course, and it is. But this was a serious accusation that was leveled against Jewish communities in Europe all throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern era, even into the 19th and early 20th century, right? That is obviously not true. But this was often leveled in the Easter season, and Lent season, which was often a time for sort of anti-Jewish sentiments to be stirred up. What was called the blood libel was often leveled against Jewish communities and became an excuse to persecute and harass, persecute, kill, expel Jewish communities. Often what would happen is a Christian child would turn up dead through some accident or illness or who knows what, and then that mysterious death would be pinned on the Jews, claiming that every year they would need to kill a Christian child to use his or her blood in the matzah. That's obviously not true, right? In fact, matzah only contains flour and water. No other ingredients, no yeast, it's unleavened bread, nothing else. Occasionally you'll see egg matzah, which is a little bit of a different thing, has egg in it, but generally matzah only has flour and water. And it's particularly outrageous that Jewish communities were accused of this because, in fact, consumption of animal blood, and all the more so human blood, is prohibited under Jewish law. In fact, one of the things that makes meat kosher, appropriate for eating under Jewish law, is that it is soaked and salted to remove the blood from it. This, animal blood of a cow or a chicken or something like that. So it's particularly outrageous that Jews were accused of consuming blood when that's forbidden by Jewish law. But this blood libel inspired centuries of anti-Jewish violence and persecution into the 20th century in certain places. So figured I'd start there just to clear that up on the off chance any of you were concerned. But yes. Okay, so next misconception. This one is there's some debate about, but I'll put forward what I think is a reasonable thing to say. So another myth or misconception, this is more of a misconception, is that Jesus' Last Supper was a Passover Seder. Here we have the Last Supper. And this is often used as a way for Christians to justify incorporating aspects of the contemporary, and specifically the rabbinic Jewish Passover, into their celebrations of Easter. Now, and again, Pastor Jim, please jump in here because I always hesitate to speak about other people's tradition, but from my understanding is the Gospels do in fact depict the Last Supper. There's a difference between, I think it's the Synoptic Gospels and then John, yes? So the Synoptic Gospels say it was on the first day of Passover. The synoptic, that John says, I think was a day or two before. The Gospels depict the Last Supper depict the Last Supper occurring on or close to Passover. Conceptually, there is an association there where, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong, Pastor Jim, but my understanding is that the the sacrifice of Jesus himself comes to take the place of the Passover lamb. That was an essential part of how this holiday was observed in ancient days. Each family would gather together, sacrifice a lamb in a particular way, and eat it on Passover. And part of the conceptual association between Easter and Passover is that Jesus is that lamb, right? Is that, Pastor Jim, is that more or less accurate? Okay, right. So there is a conceptual association. However, what we can say for sure is that the Seder as the Passover meal and celebration of it that we observe today only developed in the generations and centuries following the life of Jesus. So sometimes Christians will go to a contemporary Jewish Passover Seder and say, oh, this must be exactly what Jesus and his circle of disciples were doing right the night he was betrayed. And that simply can't be the case because almost all of the traditions that are Jewish traditions associated with Passover developed after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, a generation or two after Jesus lived and died. And so it simply couldn't have been. And there are many of the supposed parallels between what happened at the Last Supper, bread and wine, right? Those would have been the elements of any formal meal, not necessarily one on Passover. But that's particularly another sort of misconception I want to clear up. And particularly nowadays, when certain Christian communities will host their own seders, and in so doing, take these not biblical, not Old Testament, but Jewish, rabbinic, post-Second Temple rituals, and take them for themselves, impute, and even more so, impute a Christian symbolism or meaning into them. I think it's fair to say that most Jews would find that appropriative and offensive, and not something that should be done. Many Jews will invite non-Jewish friends, relatives, neighbors to their Passover Seder. That's totally fine, and I think non-Jews participating in a Jewish Passover Seder is totally fine, and we can share that. But it's really not something that, in my opinion, that Christian communities should host a Seder as if it's exactly what Jesus was doing, because it simply couldn't have been. What I will say is that there are plenty of Christian traditions for this season, from Maundy Thursday and, from my understanding, and other things. Right? You guys have plenty of your own stuff. Do that. Seriously, there's Christians also have 2,000 years of traditions that have developed around these holidays. Do that. You got plenty of your own stuff. Some of it even references the Exodus, and go for it. You got your own stuff. Do that. Right? Yeah.
So
sure.
You talked to me one time about Hanukkah.
Yeah.
Like, if a Christian should say, I'm going to pay respect to Jewish people by having a Hanukkah menorah in my home.
Yeah.
So you had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I thought, I appreciated the impulse. I think, what I sort of suggested to you, and you did, is again, this is like our stuff, and these are like our sacred traditions, our mitzvot, our commandments, the ways we connect with God, they're ours. While we're happy to sort of talk about them and share them in that way, right, to then take them and impute, particularly to take them and then impute Christian symbolism and meaning into them, is, I think, appropriative and offensive. Especially given the majority-minority dynamic that's going on there, not to mention the centuries of Christian anti-Jewish persecution. So, in light of all of that, best to be very careful. I think I would encourage Christians to be very careful when sort of helping themselves to Jewish rituals and symbols, which is distinct from Old Testament things, right? That's yours also. Right. Go for it. Right? But specifically Jewish things, including the 9-branch Hanukkah menorah, which does not appear in the Old Testament, right? Right? The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, talks about a 7-branch menorah in the temple, right? Fine. The 9-branch Hanukkah one, right? That's a specifically post-Old Testament Jewish symbol. Please don't help yourself to it.
So not in the churches?
Yes, I would say, yeah. Now, what you told me about, Pastor, there are many, non-Jewish communities, which I deeply appreciate, who sort of in solidarity want to do something, particularly around Hanukkah time, and in the service of sort of a more pluralistic society. That's great. I think displaying a menorah, serves that purpose, and that very well. Actually lighting it, particularly in the context of a church service, I think crosses a line that should not be crossed, in my opinion. Okay. That's another misconception I sort of wanted to clear up. Okay. This is a more conceptual one, right? So Passover is a tremendous amount of work to do. I'm going to be very busy this week, right? And I think sometimes Christians will look at that and say, those Jews and their obsessiveness with the law, right, and all these details, and they're driving themselves crazy for no reason. And this is so burdensome, and wouldn't they be better to be rid of it, right? I think sometimes people think of this. Is that a fair, maybe?
I think I've heard that, yeah.
that you sometimes sort of hear, and people may sort of think and sort of implicitly think, maybe not these days actually say quite out loud, but this is part of the 2,000-year argument between Judaism and Christianity, right, where Jews have been accused of being obsessed over the wrong things, and obsessed over the details of the perfect observance of the law, of the Torah, in a way that sort of misses the point. And so Passover is a particularly good example of this because there are lots of very complicated laws and traditions surrounding it. People will turn over their homes looking for any spot of leavened bread, crumb that's hiding behind the couch or whatever, right? We do this, and it can get a little absurd. And I think it's easy particularly for Christians to look at that and say, look at those Jews who are just sort of obsessing over the wrong things.
I think St. Paul, we could do a whole series.
Yes, this is sort of the essence of the argument between Judaism and Christianity.
St. Paul in
yeah.
particular is one who kind of uses the law
Right.
as a foil.
Correct, right.
To say they need the law for salvation,
Right.
we don't need the law for salvation.
Right.
And that can lead to all kinds of stereotypes.
Right. And so, yes, Passover is a lot of work, right? I'm going to be very busy this week. A lot of cleaning and cooking and, getting rid of any possible spot of, chametz, and you can drive yourself crazy doing this, and yes. However, that's not at all, in general, how this feels from a Jewish point of view. We see these mitzvot, right, these commandments, or works, roughly speaking, in Christian terms, as a gift, as an opportunity, as part of our covenant with God, as an opportunity to connect, as a treasured spiritual tradition, and that we don't see it as burdensome at all. At least not conceptually, right? When you're scrubbing your oven at 11 o'clock at night, right? There might be something. Really, do we have to do this? But in general, right? We understand our tradition as a tremendous gift and as part of our covenant and relationship with God. We do that as part of that ongoing relationship, not because we're getting something out of it, earning a place in the afterlife or anything like that. Right? Just as this is the terms of our covenant with God, and we accept it. It was given in love, and we accept it in love. That's how this feels from a Jewish perspective. And all the more so with Passover, right? It's all in the service of this very carefully structured pedagogical experience. The whole purpose of the Passover Seder is to tell the story to the children, using foods, storytelling, songs, right? All of these different things that engage, particularly the child's imagination, to be able to pass down the story from one generation to the next. That's the whole point of it. And all of the work and the effort and the obsessing over the details, right, is all in the service of that. Finally, right, this is sort of another myth. I did 4 of them because 4 is a big number in Passover, as you'll see. So myth number 4 is that Moses is the main character of the story told in the Passover Seder. And of course, if you open the book of Exodus, that's what you would think, right? Actually, in this traditional text for the Haggadah, right, of the Passover meal, which is called the Haggadah, the telling, and we'll get to that in a minute, Moses, actually I checked, he is mentioned once in passing. But that's not in a citation from something else, but that's not even the point of the passage, right? Moses barely appears, effectively doesn't appear in the whole retelling of the story that's in this book. Instead, right, the Passover story focuses on the relationship between God and the Jewish people, as exemplified, but not limited to, the Exodus story, right? So part of this is that we are meant to see ourselves as if we personally had left Egypt, and so that we relate to the story not as something that happened once long ago, but as something that in various ways is continuing to happen over and over and over again, and will continue to do so into the future until the end of history. And so, there are, even in this attempt to tell the story, if you look through this, you'll notice that there are a lot of, big pieces of what you read in the first 15 chapters of Exodus that aren't really there or aren't there very much, including, Moses as a character, because again, it's really emphasizing this aspect of the relationship between God and the Jewish people. Okay. I hope that wasn't too provocative. But I feel like, I know you all and you know me at this point, so I wouldn't have done this anywhere, but like I think it's important to sort of clear up some of these misconceptions. Okay, so what is the Seder, right? So the word Seder means order, and it is an ordered, highly structured ritual meal. Interestingly, when the rabbis who created the Seder drew on something from their surrounding cultural context, the Greco-Roman symposium, right? So in Roman culture, right, men of leisure would get together, they would lie down on couches, they'd be served a fancy meal, they would drink wine, and then use this as a setting for the discussion of philosophical questions. This was called the symposium. The rabbis adopted that model. When I say the rabbis, I mean the Jewish leaders who emerged a little bit before, but really following the destruction of the Second Temple to create a version of Judaism that could be picked up and taken anywhere, and that wasn't reliant on a single temple in Jerusalem. Okay. The rabbis who, in the absence of the temple, figuring out, okay, now what do we do for Passover, right, created, among other things, the Seder, right, this highly structured meal, and they drew on something from their surrounding cultural context, right, this Greco-Roman symposium, this sort of philosophical dinner party, to create a Jewish version of that. Right, so Judaism also never existed in isolation, right? There are significant components of our religion all along that were drawn from our surrounding cultures, but then modified in significant ways as well. All right, so a lot of it consists of symbolic foods and rituals. We'll get into what some of those are. And then there's the Haggadah, which means telling, right? So this is a book. It's a text that guides the meal containing prayer, songs, biblical commentary, all kinds of things. So I have here for you, which you're welcome to take. Now, if you look on this, you'll notice that these Haggadot were published by Maxwell House Coffee Company. Now, you may ask yourself, why would a coffee company publish a Jewish religious text? It's a good question. So about 80 or 90 years ago, Jews avoid leavened products, right? Anything with yeast in it. I'll say more in a moment what that means, but certainly anything with yeast in it and so forth. There's also a tradition that European Jews have to avoid rice and legumes, even though those aren't leavened products, to nonetheless, for complicated reasons, avoid rice and legumes, beans, on Passover. Jews from the Middle East don't do this, but European Jews do, because they didn't understand what bread was. and also, it was rice and wheat would often be served, stored in the same places, and they get mixed together, whatever. Right, but Jews, for the most part, Jews from the Middle East don't do this. They happily eat rice and beans on Passover. So when there was the great wave of Jewish migration from Eastern Europe to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, they encountered coffee for the first time. There wasn't really coffee in Eastern Europe. They drank tea. So they get to America and they hear coffee beans, and they say, uh-oh, maybe coffee beans are not kosher for Passover. Now, coffee beans are not actually beans, right? It's a berry that's roasted. So to emphasize that coffee is kosher is acceptable to eat on Passover, that the coffee beans are not actually beans, some clever marketing person decided, well, we're going to publish Haggadot. Maxwell House has continued to do this for the last 80 or 90 years. 50 million of these have been printed. And this is like an only in America story. These were used at the first White House Seder conducted by President Obama in 2009, which was, I'm sure their marketing people were quite happy about that. You can get these for free in the grocery store this time of year. And I have stacks and stacks of them that people have given me, so I'm happy to be rid of them, and you can take as many as you'd like. Okay, so this is a Haggadah that's very widely used because it's so widely available. Like I said, 50 million of these have been printed over the last 80 years. So this is a traditional Haggadah. If you open it, it'll open the opposite way you're used to, from the right. And you'll see, everything is in Hebrew and then also translated with some instructions and some illustrations. But there are many different versions of the Haggadah. I have a personal practice of buying a new one every year. I have to limit myself because there are many new ones published every year with different commentaries and different art and some serious ones, some sort of jokey ones, whatever. All right, so that's what a Haggadah is, and is sort of the book that accompanies us through this ritual. All right, so the core of what you'll find if you attend a Seder is something that's called the Seder plate. I brought one here with me. This is, and you'll notice it's this plate that's used for this purpose, and it has room for 6 different foods on it that serve as sort of the centerpiece of this, of the meal. All right, so this is like what one looks like with all the different foods. I'll explain what they all each are, but that's what one looks like. So the 5 or 6 things on the Seder plate. One is the shank bone, the zroa, which represents that Paschal sacrifice, that lamb that was sacrificed. In ancient times, we don't do this. We haven't for 2,000 years actually sacrificed a lamb as the centerpiece of the Passover ritual. But sort of in remembrance of this, we have an animal bone. It's not eaten. It's not even touched during the Seder. It's just sort of there as a symbolic representation of that old practice. We actually are very careful to not suggest in any way that we are offering the Passover sacrifice anymore. So that's why we sort of point it. We don't even touch it, let alone eat it. We just don't do that. But it's there as like a symbolic food, and it's explained at a certain point. The next is the egg, a roasted or boiled egg, which commemorated a different sacrifice that was offered on every festival, including the Passover, and also sort of symbolizes springtime, renewal. People also tend to eat a lot of eggs on Passover because it's a food that's permissible and you can do a lot of things with. A lot of concern this year about the price of eggs because it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon. You're hosting, you're having a Seder to buy dozens and dozens and dozens of eggs over the course of Passover. So people are concerned this year about that. But yes, there is an egg that is also not eaten, although some people will also serve eggs at the Seder just as a food, as sort of a custom, but it's not eaten in any kind of ritual way at the Seder. Again, just symbolic. There are 1 or 2 types of bitter herbs, right? This does come from the Torah. That talks about eating the Passover sacrifice on bitter herbs because the Egyptians embittered our lives when we were enslaved in Egypt. And so to sort of we taste our memories, right? That's what the Passover Seder is all about. We taste our memory of enslavement through these bitter herbs. Many Jews from European backgrounds will use a horseradish root, or romaine lettuce also, or some other kind of bitter lettuce as part of that. Then there's charoset, which who made the charoset? Someone made the charoset. Thank you, you made the charoset. Charoset is a particular Passover thing. It's a sweet paste. One common recipe has apples, nuts, wine, and usually cinnamon. It's supposed to reflect the mortar that was used by our ancestors to build things in Egypt. That's sort of, the more traditional European recipe. Jewish communities all over the world would use whatever fruits and nuts they had at hand to make some kind of paste. And someone's made charoset, you made charoset, thank you very much, with the recipe I sent you. And you're welcome to try that. That's probably among the Passover foods that is not an acquired taste and is made with easily accessible ingredients, so I figured that would be a good one to try. And then finally, karpas, some kind of green vegetable. People will sometimes use parsley, or celery, potatoes, some kind of vegetable that grows in the ground, which is then dipped in salt water, which symbolizes the spring and the initial flourishing of the Israelites in Egypt. This is also something, by the way, that was borrowed from the Greco-Roman symposium. The symposium would often begin with like sort of heavy appetizers of different vegetables, and that was incorporated into the Passover Seder and then given a symbolic meaning. Those are the components of the Seder plate. All right. What else? What other kinds of foods and symbols might you see on the Passover table? So wine, again, borrowed from the Greco-Roman symposium, right? That was a meal that's structured around the consumption of wine. So is the Passover Seder, or grape juice for children or people who can't have wine for whatever reason. There are 4 different cups of wine, which I'll talk about in a moment, although not in the way this picture depicts. You just keep filling up the same cup. But 4 different cups of wine, just sort of that the meal is structured around. So that's very important as a symbol of joy, as a way of bringing certain gravity to the occasion. Matzah. Okay, so this is matzah. Matzah is unleavened bread. It has no yeast in it. What makes matzah is it's made with flour, just like minimally processed flour. And from when the flour or the water hits the flour, it is cooked within 18 minutes. That's what makes it matzah, because within that period of time, it's believed that it doesn't start to leaven. After that, it does. Usually it's even quicker than that. This is machine-made matzah, which is a 19th century innovation. Total perfectly square matzah that's made, on an assembly line. But there's also matzah which you can buy, which is still handmade in the traditional way. It's a very labor-intensive process. And that is sort of imperfect circles, right? Because it's a handmade product. So it's sort of, generally sort of circular. But perfectly square machine-made matzah is a relatively recent invention. I sometimes will see depictions, in different Haggadahs of, the people Israel, right, leaving Egypt, right, under the cover of darkness with this like perfectly square matzah in their hands, and that's a total anachronism, because this is this is just not what it was. I meant salt water, right? And initially, we dip twice, and the first of those dips is the vegetable into salt water. The salt water, again, originally borrowed from the Greco-Roman Symposium of eating vegetables with vinegar, actually. But then that was turned into, became salt water for various reasons, and the salt water was given the symbolism of the tears, right? So this is that we cried when we were slaves in Egypt. So again, all of these foods, right, may have arrived in different ways, but were eventually given symbolic meaning, connecting it to the story. Passover, like I said, is about eating our memories and having that sort of sensory experience of them. Finally, this isn't a food, obviously, but there's a custom to lean that also comes from the Greco-Roman Symposium, right? Maybe you've seen depictions of this where, the great Roman men of leisure would, recline back on a couch and be served their food. And so we sort of have that same custom where we recline when we're eating certain of the foods. Again, to show that we are free, that we are people of leisure, we're free, we're no longer slaves, we can recline. Okay. So like I said, the Passover Seder is very highly structured. It has 14 steps. And there's this little medieval rhyming song that helps you keep track of them. So I'll sing with the tune that I sang growing up, which is not the tune that most people know, but I like it. And you'll notice it rhymes. Kadesh orchatz, karpas yachatz, magid rochza, motzi mahatza, maror korech, shulchan orech, safun baharech, Hallel nihirtza. So these are the 15 different steps of the Seder. Just to go through them quickly, right? The initial sanctification of a wine, as we would do on any Sabbath or holiday. Washing, eating the vegetables, the karpas, is that first appetizer, of course. Yachatz is breaking the middle matzah. There are 3 sort of ritual matzahs. The middle one is broken. Then the core of it is magi, the telling in various different ways of the story. That's the bulk of the Seder, is that step. We then wash our hands again before eating bread, as we would do any time, but including on Passover. Saying the blessings over matzah, maror, the bitter herbs, eating those bitter herbs. Korech, there's a custom to then wrap them together into like a sandwich, and that's also when the charoset is eaten to sort of cut the bitterness of the maror. The festive meal, right? So there's a full festive meal served as part of it. We then look for a piece of matzah that had been hidden earlier, which we need to finish the Seder. We then say the grace after meals, again, as we would at any formal meal, but including on Passover. Then there are Hallel, songs of praise, and finally the conclusion of the Seder. Those are the 14 steps, and you'll see them outlined here. All right, so I mentioned the 4 cups of wine, right? And again, they each arrived in sort of different ways based on how the structure of the meal, but they're often associated with this passage from the Bible, where there are the 4 languages of redemption. They're called the 4 different terms God uses to talk about what God was about to do. Right? I bold them for you. I will free you. That's the first cup. I will deliver you. I will redeem you, and I will take you to be my people. And each of those cups is associated with one of those statements. There's then a 5th one. I will bring you into the land that I swore to give to your ancestors. That is often associated with a 5th cup that is poured but not tasted, called the cup of Elijah. And that, like I said, towards the end of the Seder, we sort of look forward to the end of history. We look forward to the Messianic redemption. We see the Passover story as sort of like a foreshadowing of the ultimate redemption at the end of history, the coming of the Messiah. part of that Jewish messianic scenario is return to the land of Israel. And so that fifth cup that is poured but not tasted is like looking forward to that future thing. And that's sort of the fifth language of redemption. I will take you to the land. Okay, some other Seder highlights, and here we'll open the book. So there's a few key passages, so I'll just sort of point them out to you. On page 9, you should all have the same pagination. Page 9. Right, so this is the 4 questions, right? This, again, aspect of the Seder, also taken from the Greco-Roman Symposium, where the conversation is, is kicked off by a child's question, asking the teacher, what is justice? Right, some kind of Greco-Roman Symposium like that. Here we have the child's question where the child notices, hey, we have all these strange things that we're doing tonight. What gives? And the custom is to have the youngest person present ask those 4 questions. And then the whole rest of the Seder is an answer to those 4 questions. Why are we doing all these weird things? Because of this story that we're commemorating. So that's the 4 questions. Another fun passage is what's known as the 4 children, which begins on page 11, where in a few different places the Torah talks about the process of telling the story to future generations, and along comes this text which says, well, actually, those couple different times the Torah talks about that is talking about 4 different kinds of children, 4 sort of archetypes of children, right? The wise one who wants to know, all the details. The wicked one who says, who cares about any of this, right? This is all a bunch of nonsense. The simple question who just wants to know the basics, what's this? And then the one who doesn't know for whatever reasons, lots of commentary about why that is, doesn't even know how to begin, doesn't even know how to ask a question, and you open up for that child. That's another highlight of the Seder. Yes, on page 14, and this one is something I may focus on this year in my Seder. If you look in the middle of page 14 underneath where it says, elevate the cup of wine and say. Again, Passover is understood of the Seder not just as a thing that happened once, but as a sort of a pattern that repeats again and again. And this is what we say in this passage, V'hi sha'amda. This is the promise, right? This promise to Abraham, right? If you look in the previous paragraph, promise to Abraham from Genesis 15, that his children would be strangers in the land not theirs and be enslaved for 400 years, but then eventually be redeemed. And then we say, and this is the promise that has, sort of sustained us all through this, right? That very moving passage, actually, right? For not only once has someone risen up against us, right? But in every generation, some have risen against us to annihilate us, but God somehow sees us through each time. And some, like I said, that repeating pattern, not just something that happened once. That's an important part of the Seder. The 10 plagues, right? So you'll see as it goes through in its own way, if you look on page 19, talk about the 10 plagues. We named them all. That's on page 19. You'll see the nice little illustration above of the 10 plagues. In fact, there's a custom to remove a drop of wine with the spoon or your pinky from the cup to sort of diminish our joy at the suffering that accompanied our liberation. Right, and then finally, one of the best-known Passover songs is Dayenu. Where is it? Here it is, on bottom page 21, where we recount all of the different steps of this process, right, that we're commemorating, and said, any one of those would have been enough reason to celebrate and to thank God, so all the more so for all of these things happen, and that's a reason to celebrate and to thank God. Okay. So that's sort of the basics. Maybe we'll have time for a couple questions, but you're welcome to keep this and to sort of look through it. And happy to take some questions, then we can taste the charop set. Yeah.
Question. How much of it is spoken in Hebrew?
So that varies actually, and so something I should have mentioned earlier is that as structured and tradition bound as the Seder is, no 2 Seders are ever alike. Every family does it in their own little way, in their own, and every group of people you have gathered every year, right? A lot of this is would be recited word for word in Hebrew or in other languages based on sort of who's there. But it's meant to be a springboard for further discussion and conversation. And so that even in very traditional communities, no two Seders are ever exactly alike for that reason, because it's meant to be not only a text that is just sort of recited as a liturgy, but then as something that prompts further discussion and conversation. And that's really what Passover is all about. So yeah, but how much is done in Hebrew will vary sort of family to family based on their comfort with it. Yeah.
So is there just one Seder plate?
Yes.
Does everybody take part?
So yeah, yes. Yes. So there is one Seder plate that is. Yeah, go back to the Seder plate. Thank you. Yeah, so there's sort of one Seder plate, like for the table, sort of as a centerpiece, symbolically. But then separately, there were all of these foods that everyone eats, including, not all of them, but including the bitter herbs, the haroset, and the green vegetable, or the vegetable. There'll be like additional bowls of those things set out for people to eat. You don't eat off the Seder plate. That would be like a faux pas. Right, so this is sort of like a sort of symbolic centerpiece, but then of these 3 or 4 of them that are actually consumed, there will be, at a Seder, you'll have additional bowls of those things out for people to actually eat from. Yeah.
And during Passover,
Yeah.
is it just one night at one specific time, so all the Seder dinners are being held at the same time,
So-
or could you have more than one?
Yes, so, this has always been the case, but including today, in the land of Israel, there was only one Seder, and Passover is only 7 days, like the Torah says. For various complicated reasons I won't get into, outside the land of Israel, all the holidays get an additional day. And so Passover outside the land of Israel is 8 days, and there are 2 Seders. So this year it's Saturday night and Sunday night. There are 2 Seders. We sort of repeat the first day of the holiday because we're not 100% sure about the calendar, or at least we used to not be. And so we're not 100% sure about the calendar, and so we sort of do the first day of the holiday twice, just to cover our bases. But Jewish law is a gift. No, it's a tradition that developed, because there was uncertainty about the calendar. Today we're still very certain about the calendar, but our ancestors did it, and so we do it too. And so the first day of the holiday is sort of repeated, and there are 2 Seders, which is nice because you can do like one with one side of the family, one with the other side of the family. So it keeps everything nice and peaceful. But then Passover then continues for the following days, where you would not have additional Seders after that. But it's still Passover in the sense that leavened bread remains forbidden, and there are some other things too, but that's like the characteristic thing where we continue to eat matzah, or at the very least refrain from eating leavened bread over the remaining days of the holiday.
I have a question.
Sure.
There is different types of Jews where
Sure.
I'm at.
Yeah.
And do they do the
There are different
same-
types of Jews in my house.
Twofold.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Do they also celebrate the same way?
Yes, like I said, like no 2 Seders are ever exactly alike, and lots of families have their own sort of individual family traditions for how they celebrate certain songs they sing or things they do or whatever else, recipes that were passed down. Like everyone has their own sort of Passover shtick. So yeah, so like even in very traditional communities, no 2 Seders will be alike. But then the Seder, in sort of more progressive communities, right, the Seder is taken in all kinds of directions. I'm not personally the biggest fan of this, but many people will use the Seder as a way of talking about like a specific contemporary issue. That personally doesn't do anything for me, but that is a thing you'll see out there, where they'll say we're gonna have a Seder and the theme is whatever, pick whatever social justice issue people are concerned about. And we'll sort of use the Seder as a way of talking about that. But again, that is in the spirit of what Passover is, because we're meant to understand this as not as something that just happened once, but as this ongoing pattern that repeats and repeats and repeats throughout our history and throughout human history. And so that is in the spirit of Passover, to use it to talk about contemporary events, and to see ourselves as if we were there. That this isn't their story of our ancestors or someone who lived a long time ago, but it's our story, it's my story. We understand our own lives in the terms of Passover. So sort of in that spirit, to like use the rituals and symbols of the Seder to talk about specific contemporary issues is sort of within the spirit of the holiday. And in more progressive communities, you'll see that kind of thing. Yeah.
Okay,
Sure.
the history of chocolate-covered matzah.
Yeah.
And the jelly rings.
Gosh,
and
yeah.
The marshmallows. Those
Yes.
are my favorite.
Yes, so there's all kinds of Passover food. So food for Passover has to avoid leaven, of course. And so that makes things complicated, particularly in this era of industrialized manufactured food. And so food will be certified as kosher for Passover. In addition, there is also the Ashkenazi, the European Jewish custom to avoid legumes and rice and corn, which is a big one, on Passover, which knocks out a lot of stuff because of corn syrup and everything. So if you take that custom, it's a custom, but that's another one of those where everyone knows it makes no sense, but our ancestors did it, and who are we to say they were wrong? Like that's sort of the attitude. So that's kind of how I feel about it. But yeah, so Passover food avoids all of those things, and so you end up having to get creative. Hence the chocolate-covered matzah, and there are these like ring jelly things that are total. Oh, I think they're disgusting. But they're made with sugar, right? So you can interestingly, by the way, right? So Coke makes kosher for Passover Seder, kosher for Passover Coca-Cola and Diet Coke. That's made with real sugar, not with corn syrup. Has the yellow caps on it. If you go looking this time of year, if you want to have a taste of what Coke used to be before they switched out sugar for corn syrup, go find the kosher for Passover Coke. I think the Stop and Shop in Portchester has it, but has the yellow caps on it, and it's Coke that's made with real sugar, not with corn syrup. So if you want to have a taste, a blast from the past, you can have that. And they're like real Coke aficionados who like wait for this time of year to go, because corn syrup is, falls into that category of like things that are not leavened, but nonetheless European Jews avoid on Passover. And so corn syrup is a big one.
So who's been to a Seder?
Yeah, I should have asked that at the beginning.
So if you haven't been to a Seder,
Yeah.
you have an excuse now to raise the subject with your friend, with your neighbor, with your family members. Oh, the rabbi came to church today and told us about Passover, and I thought it was so interesting, and I would just love to go to a Passover.
Yeah.
We just kind of drop a little hint.
Yes.
I have a little sign over here that says Happy
Yes.
Passover to our Jewish neighbors.
Yeah, and there is, by the way, a tradition of that kind of thing at the Passover Seder. If you look on page 8, right, we say towards the beginning, let all who are hungry enter and eat thereof, and all who are in distress come and celebrate the Passover. The Passover Seder begins with this sort of like, kind of perfunctory at that point, you're already sitting down at the table, invitation, right, but there is a tradition of people hosting big Seders and inviting friends and family, and just, because part of the idea is let all who are hungry come and eat. You're meant to extend hospitality during Passover.
So if you want to use that sign, we do these for all the different holidays. Right? We had Ramadan, we had other holidays. If you want to hold up that sign, get a picture, and put that on your social media. Maybe you want the cross behind you, and it says St. Paul's on the bottom to show that we're saying as Christians that we want to wish a happy Passover to our neighbors. So I think an important kind of takeaway for me today from this is that our traditions share a lot in common, and that works to bring us together, and it works to bring us apart at the same time. The things that we have in common are sometimes reason for us to argue about things, or to kind of tug of war about certain things. So if we're thinking about the connection between Judaism and Christianity in a vacuum without any Jews around, we don't know what those things are or how we're misunderstanding. Certain things are often used in a way that pulls us apart rather than bringing us together.
So which is a simple question that you said earlier when we get home. What was Jesus eating at the Last Supper?
It's a great question.
I like the idea.
So we had matzah.
I'm going to bump that is not true.
Yeah, no, it's a very compelling idea, right? So again, there is an association between the Last Supper and Passover, for sure, right? Three of the Gospels say it took place on the first day. Right. It may have been some kind of unleavened, particularly if it was actually the first day of Passover, he almost certainly would have been eating unleavened bread, right? So there are certain elements, yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, from my reading about this, right? The Gospels do not depict them eating lamb necessarily at the first Seder, at the Last
It tells you
Supper.
that
They had bread and wine, right? And of course, right. Again, but interesting, I can think about it, the fact that that becomes like the paradigm for communion, yes, right, right, and that's a weekly or frequent occurrence, right, not an annual holiday, right, so that also suggests that it was not meant to take that aspect of Passover, which is a once a year annual holiday thing, not a weekly or very, very frequent thing that people do.
So there's two parts to that. One is we don't know what night it was exactly.
Right.
And there's two different traditions about that, as in everything else in the Bible stories and the Gospel stories. And we know that there are a lot of things that have been added to the. So I don't even know that they called it a Seder.
No, they certainly
They
wouldn't
use
have.
that
Right,
term, they
right.
wouldn't have that ritual.
And most of what I just described, it didn't exist in Jesus' day. Right.
We do know that they.
Right. Unleavened bread, yes. Right. Because that is that's in the Torah. Right. That's and so forth.
Depending on what night it is.
Right, it was on or around Passover, right? So there is that association there, but I think to say the Last Supper was a Seder, I think is anachronistic, right? There is an association between the Last Supper and Passover, yes.
And John, for some reason, disputes the exact timing from the other Gospels. We don't know why that is.
Yeah.
So if it was the night of Passover, we do know that there was bread that were wine. We do know that they recited Psalms. I think it was Psalm 119 or something that was recited. So we do know that this group of people were always incorporating Jewish rituals that were appropriate to that time, in terms of reading the scripture, in terms of going to synagogue, whatever that looked like at that time.
Yeah.
And people referred to Jesus as a rabbi.
Yeah. Yes,
that's true. Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's a good point.
So again, this is something that's hotly contested, and there will be people, serious people, out there who will try to make the case, that there was a closer association than what I'm suggesting. I don't buy the argument, and I think, again, there is an association between Last Supper and Passover. I'm not denying that. But I think to say, oh, it was a Seder, and in particular to go to a contemporary Passover Seder and say, oh, this must be exactly what Jesus and his disciples were doing, that is certainly not the case. And so I think that's the important part to come away with.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Have just a blessed Easter to all of you and your families, and a happy Easter. Thank you. And right on time. We have at the synagogue. We have these plants that line the pathway to the entrance. And last Sunday we had an event there. I saw them, and they were still very dead and very winter looking. Right, there's like just these sticks. And then when I was there on Thursday, right, they started to have some little buds. Right, it happened this week. And I think there is that aspect in both Passover and Easter. And I'll end with this on this nicer note. Of Passover and Easter, of renewal, of coming out of the winter and something being renewed, refreshed, revived. Right, there is that aspect in both of these springtime holidays, and I think that's tied to the seasons of the year, and I think that's an important aspect of both of them as well.
You want to talk about Friday business transaction?
Oh yes, right. So once again on Friday, right, we take very seriously the prohibition on eating or possessing unleavened bread, and the custom developed in the medieval times to sell to a non-Jew leavened bread that it would be a financial hardship to actually get rid of. So a very nice half-used, very nice bottle of whiskey, for instance, right? That would be a financial hardship to actually dispose of that. And so the custom is to have people from my community authorize me to sell on their behalf to Pastor Jim. And we've done this now for many years, and sort of a legal fiction, but like it works if we all believe it. Where they put it, if you have such things in your home, right? You'll wear like a sourdough starter, for instance. You'll put it away in its own cabinet. You'll sort of close it shut and with tape or whatever, just so you're not tempted, don't accidentally go into it. And then we both lease you those cabinets and sell you the contents for the duration of the holiday, and then I'll call you up at the end of the holiday and say, I'm having some second thoughts about our transaction here, and we reverse the sale, and everyone goes in and has their stuff. Yeah, so this developed particularly a lot in the medieval times. A lot of Jews were involved in the grain business or the grain alcohol business, right? And it would have been a real financial hardship to liquidate their entire inventory every year. And so this sort of loophole workaround was developed to sort of sell, quote unquote, your leavened bread or leavened products to a non-Jew. for the duration of the holiday, so we don't actually possess, even though it's physically in our house, we don't possess it. We've rented the cabinet to Jim, so it's his, and we don't physically possess it, so we'll do that on Friday.
So one of these years I'm going to come knock on your door.
You are entitled to. Yeah, I give you a list of names and addresses. You are entitled to show up and say, hey, I want my stuff, right? It's yours. you are entitled to come take it. Yeah. Right. I want that. Half. Yeah. There are people who have like nice, like big collections of nice alcohol, and they don't, they sell it, or their sourdough starter or whatever. It's not for like your like half-eaten package of crackers, right? Like finish that. Right, but it's really supposed to. People just do it as just to sort of cover their bases as a precaution, but it's really meant for things where it would be like a real hardship to actually get rid of it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to thank you very much.
Yeah.
For your time.
All right.
You have a wedding day?
I do. I have a wedding. What? Oh yes, please try the charoset that was made. You got a little taste of Passover. It does have patty. Is that who made it? Did you made it? So it does have walnuts in it, right? So just yes, walnuts in it. Yeah. So just if anyone's allergic to nuts, just be aware.
I am aware.
Yes, it used but grape juice, not wine. So yeah, if you want, just please be aware of that. If you have a nut allergy. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Thank you.
You want to take a picture with John?
Sure.